This is Democracy in America podcast with Annabel Park and Rich Tafel. This is the conversation that we believe America needs to be having right now.
And I would just add, Annabelle, that we're going to take on some of the most difficult topics that people are actually afraid to talk about. I know I've mentioned to some friends the topics that we plan to talk about. We've already spoken about identity politics. We want to talk about the mass killings this last week. We want to talk about immigration, racism, a lot of the topics that you pretty much try to avoid if you're talking to somebody from a different political persuasion. And so we're going to have those conversations. And I'd just point out that this is a conversation. We're not debating, and that's a big difference. We're not out to score points or, send zingers. The idea is to better understand how each of us think about big issues and hope that our country can begin this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I do think we are setting the intention of trying to understand. And I can't say I represent the left, but I am definitely progressive.
And I'm a conservative, but I'm sure that that doesn't mean too much anymore in America because we have so many varieties of conservatives, and many of them would be happy to say I'm not one of those too. So I think we're in good positions there. We're speaking from more the right, more the left, but who we really speak for is ourselves.
One thing we have in common is that we're both quite critical of our party.
Yeah, I think one big difference would be that we're not on talking points, and frankly, that's really what this city where we're recording this requires of people, that if you are a Republican, you need to be on the talking points of the party and vice versa. And so we're not going to be on talking points because you really can't have a conversation if you're on talking points, and your goal is simply to score points.
Mm-hmm. So we're trying to have a left-right conversation that is thoughtful and thought-provoking, we hope.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the topic we must take on this week, just because I feel like we're kind of drowning in it, we can't escape it right now, is the shootings that occurred over the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
Saturday morning in El Paso, Texas, and then Sunday night in Dayton, Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
At some level, we're, I think, just so exhausted from this topic. The topic of shootings, the topic of racism and white supremacy, and why it is that we keep seeing young white men engaged in these violent mass shootings.
Mm-hmm.
So what's on your mind about it? Where do you want to start with this?
Great question, great topic, horrible thing to have to deal with, but it is, for me, I would even disagree with a little bit about the way you framed it, as that these are just, a series of white racist attacks. There's been a number of motivations by people who are using powerful weapons of different types to kill a lot of people randomly, and it seems that it seems like a form of suicide, that they want to go out in a very grand way and they're looking for some celebrity status and making statements. And so I do think it really represents, a fraying of the fabric of American culture. I think there's a lot of alienation and loneliness and desperation. I think people are very attracted to celebrity culture. And I personally look at this as more of a public health crisis that mutates when it's covered so much, and so much celebrity is given to these suicidal killers and cowards, and they're made into something that I actually think, sadly, it encourages the next. But our culture, our 24/7 news culture, can't resist it. And I think the thing that we want to talk about particularly is our political culture can't resist it either. So that's, and I fear that, actually. So that might be something that we could address tonight. How about you? How do you come to this?
Well, I guess the question on my mind has to do with Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a connection that we can draw between these killings and Trump's actions in the past, or his rhetoric, as some people would like to call it? Or is that unfair?
Yeah.
So that's one question I have. And that points to the questions that we were dealing with the last recording, which is like, the difficulty of figuring out how to describe Trump that actually is neutral.
Mm-hmm.
It just seems that we can't avoid talking about Trump without kind of betraying how we feel about him.
Right.
And so that's another problem that I'm not used to having. But I feel like we should take that on as well, because it is hard to talk about. I think that one NPR stories I heard is that one of the editors criticized their own reporters for calling Trump's rhetoric racist.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was really interesting.
That is really interesting. So here's how I look at it. I think particularly for progressives, Donald Trump is everything. I mean, my progressive friends talk much more about Trump and the space that he holds in their minds, much more than dramatically more than my conservative friends. So Trump is, in many ways, I would almost describe him as a troll for the left. He knows how to live inside the mind of progressives, and he's a cultural warrior with the progressives at this time. What I'm really concerned about is that we had this horrible crisis, and I do, and this will be my more conservative bias, I do believe that the mainstream media and the progressives immediately used a crisis in an attempt for political gain and to put forward the narrative they see it. And there are a number of narratives for what happened, many narratives. But one of the primary narratives in our culture right now on the left is that Trump is somewhere close to Hitler, and he's doing awful things. And any chance we must defeat him, and we'll use whatever it takes because he's so horrible. That's concerning to me because I see a lot of incivility being on the left. And so, again, I think it's a public health crisis. I actually think as a minister, it's a spiritual crisis that this is going on in America. I am certainly, believe in the Second Amendment, but I don't understand really why people who support guns couldn't be a little bit more compromising just for the greater good. But at the end of the day, I really don't like the fact that the political parties are using it to score points. It's a crisis. The fabric of the country is ripping. And instead of mourning together, being unified as a nation, we can't do that anymore. And that really frightens me more than Trump. We continue to rip. And that is going to have consequences that really concern me, because I think it's going to lead to increased violence on both sides. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. It's a little different perspective than where you're coming from.
Well, look, I mean, I am as critical as you are by easy answers, easy explanations, and kind of the vilification that happens, right? At the same time, I'm so frustrated. We've had a mass shooting just about every single day this year.
Right.
And so we're sitting ducks. I mean, I heard about this one incident where there was backfire from a motorcycle in Times Square and people ran fleeing. And I feel like I'm the same way. If I heard like a really loud commotion on the street right now, I would be just as frightened.
Right. One of the strategies of terrorists, and these are terrorists, these kids, one of their strategies, and it's not unlike what we saw from ISIS and Al-Qaeda, is very few people doing something very dramatic that's very frightening, and the fear factor is much greater than the reality. We all know that gun violence has actually decreased, and these are very small. They're on the rise, and they're absolutely get tons of coverage, but we're sort of immune to the violence that takes place in cities every night in America anymore because it happens so much, and more people are killed. And there could be even racial issues about that, why we ignore certain kids, I think largely because they're poor. And so I think, I do understand the fear, but the fear I don't think is based in too much, reality. And so they're successful about it. The way to really ratchet up the fear, though, is to turn it into a political crusade for both sides. Just to give a concrete example, what I'm talking about, I was at an event at the Watergate Hotel here, a prominent magazine here in Washington had an event that was about Trump. And it was the night that Congressman Scalise and others were killed by a Bernie Sanders supporter at they were shot, rather, at a Bernie Sanders event, but almost killed, and by a Bernie Sanders supporter. And he was upset about taking away health care and so forth. And what struck me at the event was nobody mentioned it. And I thought to myself, my God, if that shooter had evoked Trump and shot up an African-American crowd or a Jewish crowd, the meeting would have probably been canceled, but it's all we could have talked about. So I thought to myself, why aren't we speaking about that tonight? Because it doesn't fit the narrative. When the gentleman, not a gentleman, evil person shot up white police officers in Dallas, evoking the Black Panther Party, based on a racial, he was shooting white officers. I didn't, as a country, want to go there. I didn't want to play his game. He was clearly a racist himself. So this last week, when we see that one of the manifestos, which we shouldn't even highlight as much as we do because they're pretty nonsensical, but he does talk about invasions and so forth of immigrants, which is a white supremacist line. He clearly is in that camp. The kid in Ohio, it turns out, was a go blue Elizabeth Warren supporter. We've got to kill the Nazis. But the media and the left immediately turned the whole thing into, is this a chance to attack the president? And then, not just the president, but the Republican Party and conservatives, or anybody supports him. And that is inappropriate. I wouldn't have supported it with people to say, look, President Obama, this man was, said he was supporting what you were doing in Dallas. Nonsense. These people are insane. They're who cares about their politics or their manifestos? They're seeking celebrity through murder. Who cares what they think, really? And I don't want to know their manifestos, and I don't want to know. I want to know how we can deal with it, which is, to me, a much deeper issue, alienation. But I'm sure that by ratcheting it up into the political world and calling names, and now publishing names of people who support Trump in El Paso, that really frightens me. That's ratcheting it up. Yeah. And I think that's my concern with the left. Right. Let me and just on Trump, because just to be completely fair, what he has lost is the ability to be a uniting figure, which a president really needs to be.
Did he ever have it, though?
Well, no, what I mean is that a president should be a uniting figure. Frankly, even when he never had it because, the protest, even his inauguration. So the left was never going to embrace him. But there were many people in the middle, frankly, that would. And they wanted the best for him. And they prayed for a successful presidency. And they attended the inauguration. There were people who were in that middle. He's lost that ability for anybody to believe sort of what he said on the teleprompter, which I agree with what he said, and it was well written, and he spoke against white supremacy, which everybody asked for. But there's a childishness, narcissism that he cannot resist. It's who he is. And this is the time where you would be a big enough person to be above attacks, and he just today criticized political figures that he was with in Ohio and after he was with them. And so that is, that's beyond defense. That's indefensible behavior, absolutely indefensible. And he's lost. We don't have anybody in American political life who can speak about uniting us as, say, Reagan in the Challenger crisis, or even Bush in 9/11, who can unite us. I remember Barack Obama singing Amazing Grace in South Carolina, and I found it incredibly moving and uniting for the nation. So we don't have that. He can't be that. That's he's lost that ability. And now it seems like a free-for-all to knock each other out.
Well, I feel like I want to take a step back from this conversation for a second. I feel like there's a tendency to either talk about kind of the nuts and bolts of policy, like background checks, ban bump stocks, ban assault rifles, or people want to talk about things like love and hate and racism. These kind of intangible, but
so it's either like policy solutions or sort of almost spiritual, emotional principles.
Yeah,
Yeah.
But intangible.
Intangible, yeah.
Yeah, and something that you can't turn into policies exactly. Like
Right.
you can't turn love into a policy. I can't think of a way to do that.
Right.
But I feel there are other things that we need to be talking about that isn't in the realm of unite or divide. It's in the realm of, okay, let's be very realistic about what the social context is. And I think that's something that you and I have talked a lot about and would like to talk about right now is what you call alienation. And, what I would like to call loneliness. I feel that is something that all of these shootings have in common. Going back to Columbine, I remember reading about the Columbine kids as well, is that at the root of a lot of the shootings, from what I have read, it just seems like these were men or boys who were bullied, who experienced some kind of trauma, and that it led to them probably not being able to cope or adjust, and then gravitating towards violence as a solution, as a way to have a sense of self-worth.
Right.
And that isn't to make excuses for any of the shooters. That's definitely not something I want to do.
Right.
Because these were absolutely immoral and wrong and evil. But at the same time, if we really want to figure out how to prevent these things, I think we need to talk about this at another level that isn't just like, let's love each other or let's ban assault rifles.
Right. Completely agree with you on that. And what happens in a crisis where things are confusing, and this is confusing us right now, we don't really understand it completely, is that we almost immediately move to the closest solution that's next to us because we really cannot stand to have misunderstanding or confusion within ourselves. So that's why in a politically charged culture, we immediately go to our political talking points. If you're on the left, you immediately talked about guns, you talked about Trump, you talked about white supremacy and what that culture is. If you're on the right, you have your own talking points about the culture. And it's not simple. It's complex. So that I did lead a conference through Pepperdine School of Public Policy on the American Project on the Senate called a Social Capital Summit. And the whole premise was, it was almost entirely conservatives, but the whole premise was that we are in a crisis of alienation and loneliness in America that has reached epidemic proportions, and as President Obama's Surgeon General has pointed out, is affecting people's health now in a degree worse than tobacco. So this is a real crisis, but it's complex, and we don't really have there's not a quick answer of how you build back community at the local level. How do you build back family? These are very complex issues. We do, by all measures, have a generation of lost boys in many cases.
There's a book about that, right?
Yeah. He was actually one of the speakers at the event. Is it Warren Farrell, Professor Warren Farrell, which is interesting because he was a founder of NOW. He ran against Arnold Schwarzenegger as a Democrat, but he wrote a book called The Boy Crisis. And when he did, the left started disinviting him to events because they thought he was shaming single mothers. But that's a complex issue. And we do have to talk about the fact that a lot of these boys, I think in this case, it's something like 27 of 28 or something like that. I'm not sure if it's exactly that number, but it's dramatic, the number of these killers who are without a father. And there is a boy crisis in America with boys without adults male adults who guide them, which again is in no way a criticism of the mothers that are left doing everything, but it is something. So that's a very complex issue. So rather than deal with the fact that these are really complex issues, we immediately go to simple things like politics, which none of these solutions, frankly, are going to change much of anything that are being offered in the political realm. I'm sorry to say, it is much more complex. So that's why I was stressing in my own mind, it's a spiritual and a public health crisis. We know that some of the most effective ways of dealing with violence in gangs is programs that actually go to the hospital when someone's shot and immediately counsel the families involved and the teens involved to avoid revenge because it spreads like a disease. And then they know that if they can stop it, it'll spread. That is been a successful strategy in some reducing gang violence. I think the same is true here. It's just a little, it's much broader, but please stop celebrating it. And we're asking the media to do what they cannot do, which is stop talking. It's so sensational, and that's why you're afraid. But it's minute that it happens, and we'll probably have more people hurt, being afraid of an assault. And we're also, now having to teach all our kids how to behave in a school with potential killer. And I realize that is the world we're in, but it's as unlikely as a nuclear attack back in the 1950s, but it scares the hell out of children. So I would love to focus on, what's really going on and have a discussion. But as a culture, and a political culture in America, we are unable to have that conversation. We can't do it. We want quick, simple answers. 3 things: change a certain gun law, call it a mental health issue, whatever it is. And they know, those who are suggesting that it's not going to solve it, but they are looking for a quick political hit.
Well, let me clarify. I mean, I personally do think it's important to reduce the number of assault rifles because it's a very easy access to a weapon of mass destruction to me. And I do feel like love is an important principle. So I don't want to talk about that exactly. I just feel like we're missing important conversations that we can have about what's happened to our relationships, relationships in the family, social relationships, friendships, communities, and how it is that we become so self-absorbed. We become you can call it self-absorbed or narcissistic, but people are not very good they don't have social skills, and they have trouble with vulnerability and intimacy, like these social skills that at some point I feel like we just don't know how to even acquire those skills anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, my niece watches TED Talks. She gets all her information from TED Talks, but it is right now we don't even have a good vocabulary for talking about our feelings.
Right. And this is really a new phenomenon of young men acting this way. So now some studies are being done to alert schools of what you could do to, intervene at a younger age for kids who are starting to show those types of behavior. But that's not very sexy, and it's not very fun for the political culture. So I think that there are people in public health and schools who will take this on and will focus on it quietly and make changes within schools, or more aware of particularly the boy in Dayton making a list of people he wanted to kill and rape. So that's a sign. The red flag is a red flag could be. What do you do about that? How do you handle that? I think those institutions and those folks are working on that. I think they will. What I find particularly frustrating in the political culture is I do believe that the politicians are using it for their own political gain, to score points with their population. And I think that's as despicable as anything. That's where I'm,
I agree. But I also want to give them benefit of the doubt to some extent, because I think it is very hard to put our finger on these relationship issues that we're talking about. And we know it's going to take a long time, because these relationships have been eroding, these social skills have been eroding for years. And suddenly, how do you legislate on creating better relationships? There's no real legislation for it. It's just will take a lot of collective willpower to say, we want a different kind of culture.
Right.
We want to value different things.
Right. Well, I think what we're seeing in our political life right now is what we don't want. In a way, Donald Trump is the apotheosis, the ultimate outcome of bad behavior, in the sense that whatever you think about his policy issues, and a lot of them I agree with, he is not someone I would want a young person to emulate. And I think that's really the criteria for a leader. I wouldn't want a young kid. I find his behavior often very much reminiscent of 7th grade or 6th grade. Sort of, I understand he's pretty clear. He rarely attacks first, but he always attacks. So he clearly learned that, and he's got narcissistic tendencies. So he is not a role model. But I have to also say, when I see Beto O'Rourke all worked up the other day and saying he's a white supremacist and we have to, we've got to call it out, I don't think he's a good role model either. That's, I think, where I differ. I don't, and now I hear Kamala Harris is saying, when I'm in the White House, we're going to have an executive order within 30 days again, perpetuating the idea that, first of all, we have a monarchy and not a presidency. So again, people are having expectations that elect me and I'll solve this, is exactly what President Trump said. So we're not seeing that behavior, and they're trying to figure it out. Politicians are, by nature, I've worked with a lot of them, narcissistic, and secondarily, they want to win, and it's part of the narcissism. So right now, they see the Trump culture, the way he behaves, that's the way they have to behave. So Democrats are looking for someone who's equally good in the brawl, the street brawl, as Trump is. But this is not going to end well for our politics. This ratcheting up, and so we will need different leaders who can be role models of what we're talking about, which is empathy, compassion, listening to the other side, and leading with your perspective. Absolutely, sharing your views, but not demonizing your opposition.
Yeah, I mean, they call it fighting fire with fire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they do.
And they don't think there's an alternative to that right now. You know,
Right.
If Michelle Obama decided to run for office, I think people would realize there is an alternative to fighting fire with fire, because she would never engage in that. But as it is, people on the left, the Democratic base, is looking for somebody to fight fire with fire.
That's right. And I'm, for whatever reasons, and I don't know what it is, but Michelle Obama is someone I've always completely admired, more than her husband, I'll say. But then again, she says she doesn't want to get into it. The other person that people talk about, hoping that they'll jump in, is someone I'm another fan of, is Oprah Winfrey. Outside people who are not in it, but those people look at it and go, why the hell would I want to throw myself into the name-calling pit of 7th grade for what? And you will immediately be pilloried and attacked. And so I think that's the problem. So it's attracting a very different type of person who enjoys that, thrives in that environment.
Well, if I could talk to Michelle Obama, I would beg her partly to just save the country, because she might be the only one who could resoundingly defeat Trump. Anyway, but I mean, aside from that, I want to go back to our discussion about relationships.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think you and I both like the book Bowling Alone.
Mm-hmm.
Robert Putnam's book that really analyzed basically this decay in our society because people stopped joining voluntary civic associations.
Exactly, yeah.
And I completely agree.
Yeah.
I completely agree. It's the fact that I don't know exactly what to attribute it to, but we stopped joining associations. We have relied on, especially right now, these online relationships that really, it's impossible for them to deepen into real commitments and friendships,
Mm-hmm.
And so even though I spend way too much time online, and I spend way too much time on Facebook in particular, I know that it has hurt me. Like it's hurt my psyche. It's hurt my soul. I know this.
Mm-hmm.
And I do feel like I have an addiction to being online, and I consciously would like to change this. So I want that change to begin with me. I know that I want to do this because, I feel like I spend a lot of time feeling alone. I spend a lot of time feeling like I don't know who to talk to.
Well, that is absolutely the crisis that we're in, that we're feeling very isolated and alone. What our ancestors, those ancient ancestors, used to do was actually very boring things, like show up to meetings, vote on the minutes, read the minutes from the last meeting. It's super boring. And where I've really seen this, Annabelle, is in deciding to take a church on, a startup over in not far from here in DuPont Circle. And there was just a few people there, and they're primarily close to 80 years old. What I was so impressed with them was their level of duty and commitment to the institution was unbelievable. They would sit through boring meetings. They would show up when it's time to take trash out of the church, or show up for events and so forth. They were committed to the institution. And when I started preaching, I remember a young guy came up to me and said, super cool sermon, young millennial, and he said, but just put it on YouTube, and so I can watch it anytime, because I don't want to do like the prayers and all the other stuff. like just it's not a good. This is not a good use of my time. It's so frankly, what he was saying is it's boring. I just want what you said in your sermon. Put it on YouTube so I can watch it, and there's something to that, and I probably should do that. But what I've learned is there is something very powerful in the boredom of sitting with strangers that I would not meet anywhere else, listening to their story. Sometimes they're a long story, and we have to get used to boredom again. With technology, everything is at our fingertips. It's completely individualized. It's what we want when we want it. And that appeals to our own narcissism. And we're all becoming sort of narcissistic, and it's playing to it. And I don't know anybody our age who is not somewhat addicted. But for the next generation, it's going to be a much more serious problem. And for these young guys that are coming up, and there may be even connections to that living on a screen is not reality. Playing video games is not reality. The fact that when you walk down the streets of the city, people are constantly bumping into you because even walking is too boring. So they're looking at their phones as they walk. So we do have a crisis of addiction to technology and the illusion that it connects. And I'll just say that the upside of it is, so I don't want to sound anti-tech. I lately find a lot of Facebook's policies pretty despicable, the way they trade our data. But I've stayed in touch with many people from, say, high school or whatever by getting little clips of them or, little visuals that I wouldn't have had 15 years ago. And I can kind of track them, and I sort of do. So there is a cool side to technology. It's just now we know that young people who spend over 80% of their time on technology, on phones, have dramatically increased levels of depression. So it's absolutely correlated. There's no doubt what you're saying. And I think that's really, when you really want to get to the issue of what's going on with these shooters, I think some of the systemic issues is this alienation. That's, again, it's not sexy. It's not a quick answer. And government probably can't solve it. It can probably help in little ways, but we're going to have to figure out, we're going to have to sit down again as human beings, get back together for meals and friends. I'm sure you saw the statistic last week that 60% of millennials said they didn't have a close friend. So that's a startling statistic that people say, I don't have a close friend. So this is going to have consequences. They're going to be quite negative, and we're seeing it in mental health, particularly at colleges right now, mental health issues. So that's a real issue. And it would be amazing if we had political leaders who could talk about this and not necessarily have the solution through government, but, hold the technology responsible, hold the families responsible, tell young people that this is as dangerous as tobacco, which a lot of the people who come off of Facebook and come off of Silicon Valley have testified before Congress that, yes, we test dopamine, and the dopamine hit that you get while the Twitter is showing up or Facebook is showing up for you, we do that purposely to keep you addicted with bells and whistles and constant alerts. So there's a strategy behind it. We need to be more aggressive in dealing with it.
Yeah, it's a constant state of arousal, but it's rarely satisfying. So, so all these things are titillating and arousing, but just never, ever, truly satisfying. So, the word that I think I am looking for is an invitation. I would like for us to invite one another to be part of some social experience, like create experiences together and actually be together. And I think that, even though it's hard to legislate this, we can have leaders that call for this and to create invitations. And I guess that is one reason, I would like to do this podcast with you, is that I would like this to be an invitation for anybody who listens to be part of this conversation, this community, right? And for us to be able to open to hearing from others who are listening to us and want to be part of the conversation, and see if we could kind of hit reset on what is ultimately important in our relationships, what is ultimately important for our happiness and for sustainability of our country. I think it has to do with the stuff that happens when we feel heard, when we feel understood, when we feel connected. So, yeah, I guess these are intangible, but they have so much impact.
Yeah, the most important things in our life
Mm-hmm.
are intangible. So we
Mm-hmm.
live in a materialistic age that thinks that everything that is true can be touched, but love, compassion, things that are beautiful, things that are true,
Mm-hmm.
things that have integrity, these are all intangible, and they are the most important thing. I think, to your point, when I've mentioned this podcast to people, first they're like gas because they're like, oh, you're going to get in trouble by even talking about these topics and you're putting yourself at risk. That's an interesting response. The second one is, are you going to do it publicly somewhere? Can people come? Could you bring in
Mm.
a mix of progressive and conservative people into an audience and do it? I think that challenge is for us to do that because that would be getting us off of
Mm-hmm.
just being digital and have an audience. I think the other thing that we can do on this show, Annabelle, and see if you agree, I would love to make it more interactive. In other words, have callers
Mm-hmm.
be able to call in, or people send questions, or people suggest topics they cannot talk about with their family or their friends, and have it much more community driven, as opposed to just simply like what you and I come up with. But get the feedback and get the questions and hear the live challenges people are having on these topics. So
Yes.
we could make this more interactive, both in community settings, but also just digitally having it more open. So
Right.
can we invite people to share topics that they want us to cover and
Mm-hmm.
also record them?
Yeah.
We haven't probably have the technology quite yet, but we should to
Well,
record
actually, I would
questions.
set up a hotline
Okay, excellent. You know how
so
to do
people
this
can
stuff.
leave messages. I
You're
would do
much more
that.
technological savvy than I am.
So, okay, so the last thing I want to say is even though we disagree, we definitely disagree about how to describe Trump. you
Yes.
know. However, I do feel like you and I have a connection and a real friendship.
Yes.
And I would like to celebrate that to some degree, by having these podcasts because I think Lincoln was right, in his first inaugural address when he said, right, that we are not enemies but friends.
That's right.
We must not be enemies. I feel like there is something so profound in his statement. Like most people quote him talking about better angels, but I think the idea of a friendship in the political context is so important because to me, it's really just about creating a connection based on our common humanity and not allowing the other person to be dehumanized and objectified, but like being able to recognize them as fully human.
Which is why I think most people see him as the greatest president, certainly my favorite. And he didn't say it at an easy time. He said at the most polarized time. We're probably getting close to that, unfortunately. And we need a Lincoln-esque figure in our political life, maybe our spiritual life, maybe our public life. I don't know where it's going to come from. But we have to not just give up our addictions to our cell phones. We have to give up our addiction to political leaders that play to our worst angels. And that's what we're doing. We're giving. So coming full circle on Trump, because we started with Trump and you're concerned about it. As I said, I think he is a narcissistic personality that is, again, some of his policies I agree or disagree with, but him as a person, he's not a role model for how we can interact or particularly for young people, which I think is very important. I think they're seeing very bad behavior, and I think the Democrats are mimicking it as well. And my advice to you as a progressive is stop giving him so much space in your brain. Because if you want to use the analogy of these shooters, what they want is for us to keep talking about them. And I think we do need to analyze and understand what's going on, but not turn them into political pinatas that both sides can use. The same is for the president. Progressives, when I sit down at dinner with them, I say, I'll give you 5 minutes to talk about Trump and ask me any questions. But I don't want to talk about Trump at dinner. I want to talk about you, what's going on with your family and your baby, and how's work going, and how's that relationship going, whatever it is. I don't want to talk about him all the time. So I would say to progressives, stop giving him so much of your mind, and he's trolling you and knows how to do it, so don't play the game. It's not saying don't be concerned about politics, and it's not saying don't support who you want to support in the next election, of course, but getting all wrapped up in it and the hyper vigilant culture is only going to lead to your own mental health issues for yourself, and that's not healthy for you. So stay healthy, be up to date on your politics, know your civic life, but don't let yourself be pulled into this polarized culture that feels sort of addictive in the beginning because you feel really self-righteous because you're on the side of good for once and your enemy is so clear. Don't resist that pull because it is not a healthy pull and it will be very dangerous for the country.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I hear that and I agree to some extent. But what I would want to say to you and conservatives is I feel like at some point there has to be a line drawn. Like if he crosses this line, then we're going to speak up. Then we're going to say no to him, right? I feel like there's no line right now, and that really concerns me. That I feel like he can start shooting people on Fifth Avenue, and people would say, "Well, that's just Trump."
Right. We could do a whole podcast on this, but just to give a conservative perspective on it, I would just say that conservatives are, that I know at least, are pretty clear how they feel about him and his strengths and weaknesses. A few in my circles really admire and like him a lot and love him, and they see him as a disruptor and a very healthy for culture. So they're few, but most wouldn't be that far from where you are. The difference is they would say this is our political culture. So they would see Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, Beto, the Julian Castro releasing the names of people in the district.
Joaquin Castro.
I'm sorry, it was Joaquin that I thought
his brother.
It was Joaquin? Okay, great. So it was one of the Castro brothers who released the names. If somebody gets shot this week, or something bad happens. When this last week, progressives were at Mitch McConnell's house screaming, "Massacre Mitch, Massacre Mitch," and saying on the camera, "I want to stick a knife in his heart." Why isn't that's not getting reported? So the conservatives are just like, okay, the culture is putrid. Why you keep saying to conservatives, disassociate, but you at the same time you're not disassociating yourself from. And I know the progressives say, well, it's not the same thing. And we would say, yeah, it's not covered nearly the same way. It's completely different coverage. And for the first time this week, the New York Times actually changed a headline because of progressive criticism. That's a very Orwellian thing for me, that they said something kind of fairly benign, and the progressives went crazy and they changed it. So if you're a conservative, you're saying, wow, the media is in lockstep with the progressive left, the Democratic Party, and they're telling us that we need to distance ourselves from Trump, which most people I know are not that connected to Trump. And particularly in Washington, I mean, many of the Republicans I know refused to serve or couldn't get a job because they didn't support him, as I didn't. I wrote a op-ed in the primaries, in the general, saying he was not a worthwhile Republican. He's not a conservative. So. But this constant call for the other side to do something and the obsession with Trump, for our side, we look at it and we say, disassociate yourself from a lot of the behavior that we're seeing on the left. That would be our reaction.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. I mean, we could talk for hours about this, but
but I want to talk more about Trump.
Yeah. So I have a feeling that we're going to be returning to Trump over and over again. But I would like to wrap up by, asking everyone to call in. I'm going to list the hotline number in the text box.
Okay.
But call in and share with us your perspective on Trump. And what do you think is the best way to describe Trump?
Well, we know what that's going to elicit, though.
We'll see.
Okay, we'll see.
Yeah.
How about also their solutions for dealing with the shooters? That would be also interesting. People who have backgrounds in that, because I'd like this to be very solution oriented too. What we're doing is, are there any good ideas that that both sides agree on?
Okay.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Excellent.
Okay. Thanks, Rich.
Thank you.